All right, let's go ahead and get started in the next session. And in this session, we're going to talk about another new product from Sencha, which is the React Grid, or the product also known as GRUI, the Grid for React UI. That's what it stands for. So you'll see it called Sencha Grid, Sencha React Grid, GRUI, all the same thing. And this product is actually out. It's out in a couple of versions already. So let's talk a little bit about what it is, why it's there, what the need does it serve, and we're going to do another getting started demo just to have you see it. Talk a bit about how to get it, both in the trial and in a purchase mode. I'll focus a little bit about how the product was built and a bit about the roadmap. So what is GRUI? Well, GRUI actually has a little bit of a heritage. I guess I'd start by talking about Sencha's foray into the Ext React tool. So Ext React came out as a tool that addressed the desire for having the Ext JS component set available for the React framework. So the way it was designed is we took Ext JS, we built effectively a wrapper around it that allowed every component to be used as a React component. And then that set of React components could be used in building an application. So the thinking was that just like people using Ext JS, React developers are looking for a robust set of components, and those components could easily be Ext JS components because ultimately they're all JavaScript components. Well, it turns out that in that ecosystem, if you are in the open source world, more often than not, you are pulling together different components from different places. So you may get a grid over here, you may get an open source tree view control, you may like this control from this vendor. So you'll have a mix of supported, non-supported, open source, all sorts of components. And in that environment, we had a lot of people saying, boy, it would be nice if we had your grid component because it performs well, it's tested for a lot of data. But there was a lot of resistance to the fact that it wasn't written in React, that it was still Ext JS under the covers. And that was a fair statement. And we brought the entire framework for Ext JS into any application that would use even one component from Ext React. So the thinking was that people would like the idea of taking and using all of the components, but it turned out that people really, really wanted just a few components, and in particular, the grid. So there was some rethinking and really taking into consideration feedback. And so GRUI was invented. And what makes it unique is that it is from the ground up built as a React component. So it uses all the React constructs. It natively supports JSX. It does not have a layer into the Ext JS library. But all of the good things we learned about building a grid, which was just standard JavaScript code, could be incorporated. So it takes a native React component, takes the modern toolkit grid component, and brings those things together. From that point, it became an independent product. In other words, any new functionality that may not be in the modern toolkit grid could possibly be in the GRUI grid. The biggest one I'll note is virtual columns. So those of you who've used the Ext JS Grid know that when you want to display hundreds of thousands of rows in the grid, you can. In other words, it appears like you're storing hundreds of thousands of rows, but what's really happening is that as you're scrolling up and down, the DOM is dynamically changing. So only the rows that you visibly see are in the DOM. That is not the case if you scroll sideways with 200 columns. 200 columns were in the DOM, even if you were just showing 5. So there were some people using the grid kind of like a spreadsheet with, which is not the intended use, but hey, it's okay. So one of the things GRUI did is it said that's an important feature. So virtual columns are part of the GRUI grid. So even that level of performance is taken care of. The code base to the basics for the grid were also upgraded to the latest JavaScript standards. So where we could take advantage of new JavaScript constructs, or where we just could take advantage of faster loops, anything that we could do to make it even faster, it being the grid, it was taken advantage of. So the code base is modernized for JavaScript. It's modernized for React. And also because we were just looking at the grid and we were not looking at things that all of the Ext JS components need, like relative layout management. That's not a part of this grid because it's not relatively being laid out with other Ext JS components. So there's chunks of the overall framework when you're dealing with a whole page that don't need to be there if you're dealing with one component. And there's a lot of use cases for that. So the more and more of that could be taken out, the smaller and smaller the footprint of the component is. The idea was that this component was the blueprint for any other components that could be repurposed. And there are a good number of pretty substantial components. The whole charting environment could be considered. There is a pivot grid, which could be incorporated into the grid, but there's other complex component, the calendar, other things that could be brought into this. So this was used as, kind of the framework, so to speak, of how to build React components. It easily fits into an NPM ecosystem. It is delivered through NPM. It is only delivered through NPM because that's the way open source components are delivered. And it doesn't require other plugins. It doesn't require anything but the code and the styling. And even the styling is being improved because in an Ext JS environment, you have this concept of an over-enveloping theme that deals with every component. In the React world or in an open source world, a component has to handle its own theming needs, and it is not necessarily related to anything else on the page. There are some global theming approaches, but those aren't necessarily required. So theming isn't really as important as being able to change the look and feel of the component in a way that could be consistent with other components. So we're in a new world. Why go this direction? I mean, there's a lot of pull because people are considering open source solutions. They like the Sencha components, and it seemed like the idea of Ext React made sense. But again, the market didn't want all the components, so now we're looking at GRUI as a model moving forward. So I've talked about GRUI being based on the modern toolkit, the modern toolkit grid. As the grid gets more functionality in the modern toolkit, the GRUI team will take those new features and bring them into the GRUI grid. So, for example, one of the recent additions to the modern toolkit was a filter bar that was integrated as like a row. That's now brought into GRUI, not at the same timetable because it has to be brought into a different code base, but any innovations that happen in the modern toolkit or any innovations that come from the grid can be brought in and will be brought in to the Sencha grid or GRUI. Infinite scrolling, a big deal and a big reason that the Sencha grids are so powerful and so well performing. That was one of the first things that needed to be brought in. So infinite scrolling the way you know it with virtual DOM and virtual buffering is part of the component as well. So being able to bring in pieces of data from the server as you're scrolling. And it is easy to use. I mean, it's easy to install, modify, and customize. There's no and do this additional Ext JS step. It's just a component, and that's it. So what I wanted to do is just kind of walk through the getting started, walk through what you get. Obviously Sencha realizes that, other frameworks are, becoming more important. The choice of React was just due to the, amount of demand, amount we heard of the environments that are out there. Obviously, Angular is another popular library, but admittedly not as popular as React. So a little bit of background on why. So to get started with the product, it's a pretty straightforward trial process. Just like with Ext JS or any of the other components, GRUI has its own landing page. You fill out the required information so that we can say hi to you later. See how you're doing. And a download will simply bring you to. You're not downloading at this point. You're going to download with npm. So you essentially get to the download instructions, which is essentially the getting started page with GRUI. The one thing about the trial there's two differences between the trial and a production version of GRUI. For one, the trial has a watermark, has an embedded watermark, as you'll probably see in some of the examples. And also, you can consider the trial having the basic features, and there's also some enterprise features that are unlocked when you actually purchase the product. There are two versions currently available. There's a version for React before React 18, which is the latest version, and there's a version for React 18, just because there were some fundamental differences, and you can't take a React 18 component and have it necessarily work completely in React 17. Just some anomalies. So, but if you go over to public npm and we take a look at let me go at Sencha GRUI. So at Sencha is the precursor for all npm based components. So the framework itself is at Sencha Ext Modern or at Sencha Ext Classic, and you can see here that even though the product is named GRUI, the actual package is at Sencha Grid. So this is the Sencha Grid product, and you see we're at version 2. There's instructions here to get version 1. Version 2 is essentially the React 18 version. And we come back over here to look at some of how you use the component. Probably the first thing you'll go to is either the demos, and you can see here that, you see all of the types of things you're used to. Here's an infinite grid. Here's a paginated grid with a pager component. We did build a pager component because there wasn't one in the modern toolkit at the time. So you kind of get that as part of the grid. So there's some examples. Then there's also some documentation, and I must be on the beta site. Hope not. I don't know who would have put a that's nice. I don't know why it's locked at the time. How come I'm always getting these good? Anyway, But we'll come back. We'll come back to that and try to see if we can get around that. Maybe it's the page I'm on here. There's also an introductory blog about it, which is just a link here just for completeness of information. So if you're interested in a little bit more background or exactly how it's used, you can take a look at that. And then finally, there's a webinar, which is a recorded webinar from, I think I might have done it, or maybe the partner has done it as well. So when you submit your demo request, you'll get an email. The email, among other things, will reproduce the Getting Started guide. So even if you don't go to the documentation, you can do the Getting Started guide right here, which we will go through in a second here. There's also a link to that demo that I was just showing you. And good, this one has a link that I don't think will require logging on. So there's multiple ways to get to the Getting Started. So this is just an overview. There's a Getting Started right here. I'll use this one, it's a little nicer looking, but there's also a Getting Started, which is pretty much the same right in here. So we're going to go through that. So I point out the documentation. The documentation is written using Storybook, which is a pretty popular React-based documentation tool and testing tool. Kind of got a few purposes. And the documentation itself is kind of what you would expect. There is a section that is API oriented. So, you know, if I want to know how the date column works, I can see the properties and methods and events. There is a features section, which has quite a few examples that allow you to see source code. Because TypeScript, it's not as popular as in Angular, but TypeScript is becoming more and more of a popular thing in React. We present both a TypeScript example and a JavaScript example. And the product is actually written using TypeScript. So for whatever that's worth, in whatever environment you might use it, you have both of those available to you. So let's go back and just kind of run through this. So I've got the Getting Started demo. I've also got a blank command window open, and we're just going to kind of step through the Getting Started demo. So the first thing you do with any React application is you create a new starter app. And you typically do that with the Create React App application. So I'm going to create a React app. I'm going to use a minimal template. That just means there's not going to be a lot of things in the app. And I'm going to call it My App. So this takes a little while. It goes out to NPM, grabs all the required components for React. Doesn't have anything to do with GRUI at this point. Just takes a few minutes. And then when it's finished here, we can simply CD into My App and then open the project. And I'll use Visual Studio Code to go ahead and do that. So we'll just give this a few minutes to finish. Once that's done, just to kind of explain the next step, we'll go ahead and add the GRUI package just with a simple npm add. And again, it's always scoped to @Sencha. And at one point, just like the npm packages with Ext JS, they were installed in Sencha's private npm repo. But thankfully, a lot of people didn't like that. And now, just like any other component, it is sitting in public npm. But when you sit it in public npm, you get the watermark version. So, all right, so we're done here. It just ran. We have one folder called My App. We'll go and CD in My App, and then go ahead and start Visual Studio Code at that folder. That's code dot. So you can see here it's a standard npm application. It's React 18, nothing much to it. If I go ahead and do an npm start at the terminal, this will start up React. It'll start up the built-in development server, and it will serve out the React client application at port 3000. And it is quite minimal. That's all there is to it. As a matter of fact, if you follow the path down, the index.js starts the whole structure off. The application component, which is the root component, will be installed wherever the root element is on the index.html page. And a typical starter is just underneath the body. So here's body, here's the ID root. React is going to marry those two, create whatever is in the component called app. The component called app is in the same folder. It's this notation here is an import. And then this is the default minimal set of code, which is not much, right? All it is a function that returns JSX. JSX being a combination of HTML and JavaScript, kind of the combination of the two. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take and install GRUI. So I'm going to take this npm add, and I'm going to come down here to the command line. I'll stop the running app. That's kind of like Sencha app watch that was running. I'm going to paste the Sencha grid in with I'm going to paste the npm add command. What npm add does, just like any other component, is it will add that component to the dependencies. It will install under node modules the @Sencha folder, and underneath that is the distribution. The biggest thing you don't see is you don't see any install of the Ext JS libraries, the ESTJS packages, because there is none. This is a native React component. So if you, for whatever reason, wanted to install the NPM packages for ExtJS, you could. They'd be under the same folder, but they're not connected to each other. Sencha Grid or GRUI is an independent component. Okay, so let's just work a little magic here. I guess I'll do this piecemeal. I'm going to bring in the code for GRUI. So to do that, it is, and I'm just going to be lazy and not type. I'm going to go over and just, we're going to replace app.js. So I'll keep the import to React. First thing I'm bringing in is the Sencha grid from @Sencha grid. So that is the root component that we're going to use. I also want to use a column, and there are a whole variety of columns, all the columns that you have in a Sencha grid. Date columns, time columns, whatever columns. They're all available as separate components. A regular column is just the base class, and just a generic column just shows text. So we're going to use that. I'm also going to remove, well, before I do that, I'm also going to add in the default way you utilize style sheets for the GRUI component. And that is just by bringing in a style sheet. So no longer setting the fact that you're using a theme. You're just using, well, we use a folder named themes, but it's not a theme. It's just a CSS. It can be replaced. The documentation for that is in the Storybook application. And those of you who may have dabbled in or are using React, there's a whole lot of ways to do theming within React. You can do code-based themes. You can have modules that are themes. And the GRUI team is working on integration for all of those. So again, it feels like a natural React component. The one thing I will start to address here is that this component has its own theme. If I go and buy another component or go find another component from another vendor or open source, it's probably going to have its own theming approach, right? So you start seeing the challenges that you may have as you start bringing together multiple components. You're going to have to manage all of that yourself. we still believe that the easiest and most efficient way to build applications is using the Ext JS SDK. You wouldn't have to deal with that. But we are also realists, and we know there's a big market that wants a good grid, and so that's why this product is here. But again, you're gonna have to deal with those things. So we've got that imported. We're also going to replace what gets returned, the HTML that gets returned. And again, I'm just gonna be real simple in this case, and I'm gonna take, why don't I just, I'll just take this whole thing. I'll just grab this, and I'm just gonna remove all of this. This is the equivalent of returning an app. So it returns an app object. It extends React component. They all extend React components, so that's not necessary. I'm exporting it as default. So that means when I bring app in here, it's the only thing that gets exported. If you had more than one thing you were exporting, you wouldn't have to export as default, and then you'd have to put the things you're exporting or you're importing in brackets. That's the only difference. So we've got a React component. We've got the one render method that writes out JSX. We've got a little bit of just hard-coded data, just so we don't have to deal with a store at this point. But the beauty of the GRUI component is you can use non-Ext JS type constructs. You can just send in data directly. You can do that with regular Ext JS. Or if you like the power of the data package within Ext JS, you have the full fidelity of it available. So I could just as easily have created a store here, a real Ext JS store, and given that to the grid. And then all the power of managing that store would be available to me in React. This is just a demo, so we'll just create data. And then down here, you get what looks like just normal JSX, which it is. So Sencha Grid is the name of the component. And you'll notice it has 3 columns that are child elements directly of the grid. So you look at this and you say, yeah, that doesn't look any different than any other JSX I've seen. You'll also see that the team tried to clean things up, or at least make them more consistent. So field is like a data index. It's basically the same thing as data index. Text is like header. I don't know if it's text now or it's header now, but basically field means the field in the data that you're connecting to. Text is the data. And then the layout capabilities of the grid are still there. You can use flex, you can use width, you can do whatever you want to do in this case. So 3 columns. You also lose the automatic layout capabilities of Ext JS if you go into React. There's nothing by default that lays out a component with any width or any height. You have to handle that all yourself. So in this case, we just did it the easy way. We just put a width and height in here, right? If you don't put a width and height in here, this component will take on whatever the parent component is. And if the parent component is a height of 0, you're a height of 0. And therefore, you won't see anything. So there's yet another thing that I think Ext JS developers take for granted. The layout system, which is very powerful, you have to manage yourself. But not if you make them hard-coded. So we should have everything we need. We are going to go ahead and rerun npm start. And it'll go ahead and reset. And right now it's just still building. So you can see it's still starting up here. Now it's finished, compiled successfully. And again, there's our grid. You notice it has a particular height and width because I gave it a particular height and width. I think if I were to comment this out by effectively saying there is no style property, I don't think it'll show up. Yeah, it showed the columns show up, the watermark shows up, but none of the data shows up. So that's what I meant by you have to manage that. I've gotten very good at understanding how to use the raw CSS flexbox model when I'm working with React, because you really have to understand how to lay things out in a particular way. So you learn a lot of more lower level stuff with some of these open source frameworks. So, okay, so anyway, that's some, I returned the style back to what it was. There's that, as I mentioned, there's the watermark that will go away when you buy the commercial version. And essentially we have a table here, and it's got, you know, the basic functionality that you would expect. Looks a lot like the Ext JS Grid because it uses a lot of the base code, but again, no Ext JS. Totally built with React. If I were to build this, so in the React world, building usually is npm run build. So npm run build. That'll create a build folder, much like Sencha app build does. Here's the build folder being built. And again, hopefully you get it now, but what I'm going to show you is that there are no remnants of Ext JS. It's just one big minimized and obfuscated package for React that can be delivered as part of your application. This doesn't usually take too long, so I'll just let it finish. Here we go. So there's your JavaScript. There's your CSS, all bundled together, and your index.html. And one thing I tend to do is I will, if I want to test this, I will go to my build folder, right click and bring that in the integrated terminal. And I like the fact that Sencha command has an integrated web server. So I do Sencha web port, I don't know, 2022 start. So that will start a web server on some arbitrary folder. So now it started it on the build folder because that's where I'm at. And so now if I just go over to localhost 2022, there's my production application. So pretty straightforward. I mean, there's nothing. When I show this to React developers, they're pretty underwhelmed. They're like, yeah, that's the reaction I wanted though. It's like, yes, it is. It's just a React component, but it's a powerful React component. All right. So, so that's getting started. That's how simple it is. I mean, I did indeed start from scratch. Everything came from public NPM. I didn't do anything except I don't have a license. I purposely don't have a license on there. If you want a license, if you want to know what happens when you get a license, let me go back to, here it is. So this is the NPM page. If you buy a license, this is the one line of code you have to add. So you just add the set license method and you give it a license number. So it's pretty even. That's pretty simple. Okay. You can't see that code. That's okay though. So just to highlight again one time, this is just JS. This is just React. So we have Sencha Grid and column that I brought into the example application. You can bring in as many of the elements as you want, date column, time column. It would just be additional entries, and they're all documented. You can do your own rendering. Anything you can think of that you know you can do with the Ext JS Grid, you can do with this grid. You know, the custom rendering. If you do custom rendering, you can do it with JSX. React developers love that. So your rendering is just snippets of JSX that you pump out into the cells. You can take advantage of the latest capabilities of the modern grid, like the filter bar. That's already implemented. And I kind of highlight a couple of these here. Sorry, I put the branded title up here, so the words didn't come out too high. But I'll just kind of highlight real quickly. I just talked about this one, custom renderers. So you see in this little code snippet that the column element has a renderer method. You can give that method a JSX element. You can actually build your own component and have that element be the renderer. And then that element can use one of the parameters that comes to the renderer, which is the data property. So all the data that you get is just a prop, and then you can fill that in any way you want. So it's very, very simple and very, very consistent with everything else you're doing in React. We have the full suite of column editors. So if you want to build, either row-oriented editing, where you click on the row and the whole row becomes editable, or single cell editing, and those single cell edits can be intelligent. So if it's a date field, you can pop up a date picker, all that kind of stuff. That's all built in. So all the editors are available as properties, and all of those properties can handle JSX. So if you want to be able to bring in an editor and you have your own component that you've written, here's one that's a number field editor, if you can see that one. That can all be done with a column editor. As I said, we take advantage of TypeScript. TypeScript married with VS Code is really nice because VS Code understands TypeScript and will start giving you the equivalent to IntelliSense as you're typing. You can see there just by the little animation that's showing you that. So that's nice. Keeps your code honest, I guess. There are various ways you can load data. You saw the data property. You can use stores, as I mentioned. You can write methods that do, asynchronous calls with the fetch API or with Axios, which is a popular component for writing data. You can write using new JavaScript constructs. I love async await. I mean, to me, writing asynchronous code in JavaScript is very hard to manage because you got to keep waiting for callbacks. Async await makes your code serial, makes it like step at a time, much easier to deal with. So I write async await all the time. I encourage you to do that as well. Plenty of column types: money, percentage, date, color. I think we've added like 5 or 6 different ones as we were thinking of them. So there should be, and you can write your own. So whatever you want to do. This one, as I said, is a big one for spreadsheet-like uses for the grid. You can see how when scrolling back and forth, if you scroll really fast, it's going to wait till you stop. Just like if you scroll really fast, up and down a page, it waits. And then wherever you end up is where it knows to dynamically create the columns. Just built in. You don't have to add anything. It just does it. Oh boy, hang on a second. I'll make that a little bit bigger. Sorry about that. This is called editing on the fly, right? There we go. So as I mentioned, the trial, which has a watermark, also does not turn on these enterprise features. Obviously, there needs to be incentive to buy it. So this is just a little bit of a list of some of the enterprise version features. Multi-column filtering and sorting. The column virtualization that I showed you is enabled in the enterprise version, so it's available to you. Row grouping and row nesting. I think some recent additions to the modern grid were infinite groups. Now that's a part of this grid as well. So like I said, for the most part, all of the new features that are coming into the modern grid are also coming into GRUI. The GRUI team is just like in most things from the idea approach to development, is a combination of Sencha itself and Celestial Systems. Celestial Systems is a group that I actually do some work for that is actually full of a lot of ex-Sencha people. I was talking to a few folks and just mentioning some names. And we are all part of the effort to make sure this thing is, as quality as it can be. So it's nice that there's some consistency there just from team members. And there's been some good work to get this thing done. It's the Celestial team is a development-oriented organization. They're doing a lot of work with Ext JS. I think they're a part of the Rapid Ext JS tool and also this. So I feel pretty good that, if not an actual development team that is owned by Sencha, at least it's a lot of people that I trust working on the product. All right, so given that, what is the roadmap? As I said, there's currently 2 versions out. There's a version for React 18, a version for React 17 and below. Version 2 dot something is the latest version. As a matter of fact, the way you can tell, since when I installed this, I just said npm install and I didn't give it a version number. Anytime you install something with npm, it's denoted in the package.json what version number it is. So if I can just find it, let me scroll up a little bit here. There we go. So 2.0.3 is the latest version because I just got it. In the roadmap, as I said, a lot of work is being done on styling or theming. The current theme is loosely based on an Ext JS theme, but that needs to be broken because there are so many new ways to do theming in React. Tailwind just happens to describe one of them. CSS in JS is another big one. Basically putting your Java, if you've ever done CSS, which kind of has an object-like structure, imagine doing that with pure JavaScript, where you can programmatically change things. That's a big one. And the whole idea is to make it as simple as possible to theme, because the reality of this environment is this is one of many things you're gonna need to theme. The product has been tested. There's a very popular library for material design called MUI, and that MUI library has a global theme capability. And the product team has been working to test consistency with that, for example. So again, a lot more choices if you go into this world. There's a lot more things you have to decide. Even though the product has been severely trimmed to only include the things it needs, there's still opportunities to make it even smaller. So for example, if you're doing a simple grid and you don't need all the custom column renderers, right now they do come in. But there's work to be done to just include only the capabilities that you're using in your application. So even make it smaller. Complete the migration to modern JavaScript. That's pretty much there, but if there are anything new, React itself has bound itself to a certain level of browsers. It only supports modern browsers. So if you have a need to use any of the more traditional browsers, or if anybody still uses Internet Explorer, this is not the environment for you. I hope you don't, but if you do, a lot of banks do, at least in my experience. As I said, small automatic custom builds, tree shake to make it even smaller. There's a couple of features. Sorry about this. Let me just bring this up a little bit. There's a couple of other features that are, one more, that are definitely on the roadmap that are being worked on right now. And tree grid, meaning a tree column. Tree column is very important, and that wasn't in the current release, so that's being worked on right now. Bringing in the locking functionalities of the locked grid into one component. Right now in Ext JS, you have a locked grid component and you have a grid component, which is kind of like, why aren't they one, right? It'll be one. Same thing is true for pivot grid. Pivot grid is yet another component, but there are plans to bring pivoting right into the grid. So it's just all one part of one component. And any other column types we might have used. So theming and more column or more grid features and smaller builds are really, but it's a pretty feature complete component right now. So if any of you are considering moving into that open source world, which again, just go in with your eyes open, we wanted to be a part of it. And so this is our initial foray into it. And we feel it's a pretty good foray. It's the workhorse of most apps that we see. And it's available by trial now. It is a very competitive product in terms of cost. And, we want to be really aggressive so that we can kind of move into, in a balanced way, move into this new environment here. So any questions on that? Or anybody is anybody, is anybody seriously looking in the React direction? Or I would imagine it's a pretty positive Ext JS crowd, but you came back. I've got a lot of stories like that. Yeah. They do have their own grid. Yeah.
Unfortunately, in React, it is not class-based, it is functional-based, and you cannot extend. You must have override copy-paste this part, and functional programming is not so.
Yeah, yeah. You know, the
popular.
Yep.
Because over developing over, you need more experience.
Right.
Functional programming.
There are a couple of good grids out there. The one you mentioned, that MUI project does have a grid they just came out with. It does not compete with this grid performance-wise. No way. Probably the biggest competitor is AG Grid, and that product is what we're squarely looking to provide an alternative to. Let's put it that way. It is very cost. That's why we're being so aggressive on the costs. Yeah.
I think the best grid now is Sencha.
We did, as I mentioned in the keynote, we did an extensive study, and we weren't bashful about saying we know who our competitors are in the grid world. So AG Grid was there. The MUI grid maybe was a little bit immature at that point, but there were a handful of other grids, and we put them through their paces. And where they were, Brintum has a grid. Brintum was in our test. Yeah, I'll have to go back and I'll take a look, but I think they were as well. But at a minimum, we wanted to say, we're at the top tier, and in some cases, we were at the top, especially when it came to big data and scrolling. That's where we won hands down. So, but again, we wanted to take that functionality. We tried once with Ext React. That wasn't the appropriate way to do it. Now we're taking a step saying native component is the way to go. If we see success here, we probably will do other components, but we're not at all sacrificing the focus. The king of our product tree is Ext JS, period. So just we're putting alternatives out there.
Mostly enterprise application.
That's why, yeah, enterprise. That's it. Well, that's what we think. We think it's, you can implement, I mean, people want to go the React way, and we can't, some people, that's the way they're going. So we want to be providing a capability to them. The grid is the most important thing. But then the next thing is, okay, how do I lay it out correctly? And then how do I connect it to this other component? And how do I do that? It's like, that's the whole point. Those are all these decisions that you have to make that, yeah, you've got total open freedom, but that doesn't mean it's the best way, right? We have a prescriptive way. We've been doing this for 10 years. We know how to build enterprise business applications that need a lot of data, that, build well, are secure, all of those things. So, yeah, so we still think, as I said, Ext JS is the right answer, but not everybody wants to go that direction. And
the biggest problem in that, you're implementing your product, then you will try to upgrade that version.
That's right.
And you have some packages which are not created in the version. After that, you will replace with others. After that, you will find out during upgrade, you have changed possibly 40% of your code.
That's right.
This problem is doing. I just upgraded
if I say this to you, you guys are going to say, sure. You're gonna say it's because I love Ext JS, but that is true. But you're a good example. I've heard this time and time again. Yep.
I'm in Ext JS from the second or third version.
Yep. Yeah.
I tried to jump to Angular, did not find normal grid. And like after that, after that, beautified, and always had terrible problems. In Ext JS, I have seen products which works in fourth version. It's no maintenance, just a works.
Yep.
Somebody wrote, left the company or the version maybe.
Yep.
And that's good part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the problem. I mean, we are hitting the core of the decision point. Do you want to manage some of those things, or do you want to let the framework manage some of those things? And, Ext JS is, you allow the framework to do that. You allow us to do that. When we do an upgrade, we upgrade every component and test every component so they work in the next version. Imagine an application with we have 140 components in Ext JS. Imagine an application of the same robustness with React components that you've gotten from all over the place. And all of